Hey there. Have you ever wondered how to captivate a grant funder's attention in your proposals? I'm sure you have because it's such a vital part that can make or break your request. Well, you're in luck because our very own Meredith Noble was recently in a fire panel to talk about how to create strong and appealing proposals, including what to keep in mind when preparing the goals and objectives section of your grant proposal, how to clearly communicate what your organization is hoping to accomplish, strategies for writing strong goals and objectives, and what to avoid. Enjoy!
Well, happy Wednesday and welcome to our panel today. My name is Hannah Thompson and I am on the content publishing team at Nexus Marketing, and I'll be your moderator for today's panel. Today we're going to be diving into strengthening your grant proposals. And before I introduce our wonderful panelists and we dive into this topic, I do have some logistics to cover, just a little bit about NX Unite. I'm so happy to have everybody here and exciting to see everybody jumping in the chat where you're calling in from. So welcome everybody. NX Unite is made in partnership with Nexus Marketing and is an online community resource for the mission-driven industry. The NX Unite mission is to make introductions that lead to lasting relationships and serve as a hub for connection in the mission-driven sector. As you just saw in our video, on NX Unite, you can find upcoming industry events, suggested influencers to follow, trusted solutions, cause-driven podcasts, and of course, panels with experts such as these lovely folks here with me today. Today, our panel will be about an hour long and will include both time for questions curated by my team and questions from you all, our wonderful audience, at any time during the panel, and that includes now. Please feel free to submit your questions via the questions tab, and we will get to answering them during the audience Q&A section. If you're having technical difficulties or any logistics questions during the panel, my team member, Malou DeGracia, will be in the chat as the NX Unite team username, ready to do her best to assist. And then finally, before I introduce today's panelist, just want to say thank you for attending our panel today. It's going to be recorded and accessible to both current audience members and people who register to watch it after the live panel is over. So excited to have you all here and appreciate you taking time out of your very busy days working towards your missions to be with us here. So thank you so much. Excited to learn from these outstanding experts with you all, and I will now dive into introducing them. Alice Runke, Grant Station. Alice is the president of Grant Station. Having raised over $45 million from federal, state, and private grant makers, she knows what it takes to get funded. As a former nonprofit coordinator and director and the founder of the Grant Advantage, Alice has a deep understanding of the challenges that nonprofits face. Over the last 20 years, she's worked in the trenches with hundreds of nonprofit organizations to improve their capacity to raise funds. Colton Strasser Consulting. Dr. Colton Strasser is a nonprofit and philanthropic consultant and the president of Colton Strasser Consulting, a consulting firm that works with mission-driven organizations to develop the funding, data, and leadership skills necessary to create change. Dr. Strasser's personal and professional mission is empowering organizations to create change and has received numerous awards in recognition of his academic, professional, and personal contributions to the nonprofit sector. Colton has trained more than 1,000 organizations, generated over $25 million in government grants, and supported local and national research efforts to understand social issues and community challenges better. Meredith Noble, Learn Grant Writing. Meredith is an entrepreneur, community leader, and outdoor adventurist in Alaska. She is the co-founder of Learn Grant Writing, the #1 online membership for those building a career in grant writing. Her book, How to Write a Grant, Become a Grant Writing Unicorn, is a #1 bestseller for nonprofit fundraising and grants. If she's not biking or skiing, Meredith can be found curled around a steaming cup of green tea and a good book. Teresa Huff, Grant Writing Simplified. Teresa Huff is the host of the Grant Writing Simplified podcast and the go-to expert in nonprofit strategy. She's helped nonprofits triple their funding and maximize their impact. After winning over $7 million for schools and nonprofits, she now teaches grant writers and nonprofits the strategies they need to develop millions in sustainable long-term funding. Her podcast has been downloaded in over 100 countries across 6 continents. More than 3,000 students worldwide have completed her online grant writing programs. Teresa uses her master's in education and over 20 years of experience in writing, special education, and business to help nonprofit leaders take their skills to the next level. She mentors grant writers through her interactive Fast Track to Grant Writer VIP coaching program, now available for university level credit. Learn more and listen to the Grant Writing Simplified podcast at teresahuff.com. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We're really excited to have all these experts with us. And now it's finally time to hear from them. So we'll get started. Alice, with you with our first questions. Our first question, how can nonprofits determine if they're grant ready?
So there's a couple of things that I think that nonprofits really need to look at. And I'll just mention a few, and then I know the other panelists will pipe in as well. But one of the things is just having those policies and procedures in place about how you're going to manage your finances, and having those best practices like already established is a really critical thing, because sometimes you can get lucky enough, right, to get that grant without having those, that kind of foundation underneath you to support you. And then it can really run into a lot of problems because you just didn't have the financial systems, ready. And then it can just snowball into a lot of other problems for your organization. So I think that would be, there's several different things, but I think that would be my #1 thing, to make sure that you have those set.
Thank you, Alice. Turning to you, Colton, what questions can nonprofit organizations ask themselves to determine if they're grant ready?
So the first one is, I've worked with a lot of startups, and I asked them, where do you think you're going to get your money? And they're like, well, I'm going to write grants. And I'm like, not yet. So the first thing is, do other people already support you? Have you raised money before? You're not going to come out the gate and say, hey, can you invest in my nonprofit? We haven't really done anything yet, but we could use your support. And so that goes both to your business model. Do you understand your nonprofit's business model? It goes to, do you have other forms of support? Like I mentioned, are individuals giving, corporations? I would say grants are probably your 3rd or 4th step on your fundraising journey. And then also, do you have data to show that your programs are working? I call it proof of concept. So your program has to have some information or some data for you to go out and write a grant proposal, which I call them investment proposals, to foundations. So what information do you have to show that you're a good investment and that you're ready to receive a grant? And I like that Alice mentioned the policies and procedures, because being ready for a grant and ready to receive a grant are sometimes two different things.
Thanks, Colton. All right, Meredith, when does a nonprofit organization know that it's grant ready?
I'll build off of what Alice and Colton just said. So what if perhaps you don't have those policies in place? Now what? Or you don't have your business model in place? What are your options? I'm curious, in the chat box, maybe post a 1 if you are a volunteer-based organization, or if you do have some paid staff, say maybe number 2. So 2 if you have paid staff, 1 if you're volunteer. Okay.
We can also add this as a poll. Sorry, Meredith.
Yeah. It's all right. We can kind of get a feel, get a vibe. Okay, there's some 1s in there. So I'm sure others in this group can talk about this more as well. But one thing you could consider if you don't feel like you're totally grant ready is a fiscal sponsorship. So you could partner with a very strategic partner that aligns to what you're trying to accomplish, that already has grant administration in practices in place, and you can make sure you dial in what Colton was talking about, dial in your own business model, make sure you are solving a problem that the world needs solved before going to all the trouble of getting your paperwork in order, if you will. So that's something that you could check out if you feel like you're under that $90,000 a year in annual budget. Could be one consideration. So I'll leave it at that, even though of course I could answer more on grant readiness, but hopefully that's enough of a building off of what Colton and Alice had to say.
Awesome. Thanks, Meredith. All right, Teresa, I'd love to hear from you. How can nonprofits know they're grant ready?
Well, in addition to everything they all said, of course, those are definitely key factors that I look for. I also look at their leadership structure. Do they have more than 3 or 4 people on their board? And do they have an actual leadership in place with a point person heading up the programs or multiple people? Do they have the board working as a team who are all involved in helping with fundraising and a part of the nonprofit? And to Colton's point, are the programs in place and actually serving people? Not just the idea of a program, or if we had grant money, we could do a program, but do you actually have the program where you are tracking the data, you're serving the people, and you can show there's a need in the community? And with grant funding, we can grow to meet this need even more. But for now, we are actually implementing and feet on the ground.
Awesome. Thanks, Teresa. I think the great insight across the board from everyone to kind of build your own checklist if you're listening on if you're grant ready. So kind of as we move on to our next question, and Meredith, I'll start off with you. Just in kind of as we're laying the scene, how are grant proposals helpful to nonprofits, and why is that preparation process before writing the proposal so important once you know you're grant ready?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, who here has woken up, you forgot you had a morning meeting, you race to it, you feel like a hot mess, you haven't even had your coffee yet, and you feel then like the whole day is blown because you were on your heels. This happened to me literally last week. I mean, it's an experience we all have at one point or another, right? But one thing that can be painful is that people approach grant writing like this every single time. Like, we're always barely waking up before the deadline. And it's a very painful and very avoidable way to approach grant writing. And so one of the things that's so beautiful about a hard deadline with a grant application is that it forces you to distill who you are, the problem you solve, why it matters. And there's something very powerful about getting that onto paper that can help bring clarity to the planning and to the idea that you're making a reality, whether that's further honing a program you already have or developing a project that maybe has never existed before. So what's gorgeous about the grant proposal process is that it forces that project planning to get done. I think project planning sometimes doesn't feel like the sexiest and most fun activity to do, yet it is the game-changing activity between those that get funded and those that don't. So that would be how I would say the value in the grant proposal process before you don't jump right in and give yourself plenty of time to hit the ground running.
Awesome. Thanks, Meredith. Yeah, there's nothing quite so motivating as a hard deadline. And yeah, you want to be prepared to dive into that. All right, turning to you now, Colton. How do grant proposals help nonprofits, and why is the preparation process crucial to writing a successful proposal?
Yeah, so I come at this from a different angle. I mainly worked in foundations. So I was the one giving the grants away. And then I write in the government grant space, which is a little bit of a different tone sometimes than other types of grants. So I would say the preparation is key, especially when you're wanting to go for government funding. It's like, policies and procedures on steroids. So you kind of no deadlines, but I get it. The random grant will pop up and you're like, oh, look, funding opportunity. So I think in terms of preparation, really spending time honing in and creating templates on what your program does. The other thing to remember is your program seeks funding. Funding doesn't seek your program. And so I see nonprofits all the time sort of like, well, if we do a 5-degree shift here, we might qualify for that. Or if we do a 10-degree this way. Mission creep has a very distinct smell to a funder, and most of them will call it out. So the other thing is, just making sure you're a good fit for proposals, that you've really put it together. One of the things I always say is suck the love out of your program and just answer the question. So I'm sure you have all those wonderful stories of impact, which is great. I used to read like 50 proposals in a week. At that point, I don't care. Like, what are you doing? How can I help? Like, what do you need? I'm viewing it from a very technical standpoint. And so by spending time working on your technical writing for your grant versus your stories of impact, which is great for individual fundraising. That's awesome. Keep that stuff. But working on answering the most common questions. Most grants ask the same 10 questions. So, having a really good answer to those 10 common questions prepared will, you won't fly in at the last minute, trying to get that grant done because you've already kind of done your work. So that is a little bit of a motivator to actually prep your prep for a grant.
Awesome. Thanks, Colton. Mission creep. I think that's such a helpful thing for everybody to keep in mind as they're writing. Being really intentional about finding the right grants that fit your organization. All right, Teresa, why are grant proposals important to nonprofit organizations, and why is preparation key in creating an effective proposal?
Well, it definitely, like they said, helps clarify and really figure out what's important. And one thing that I've talked about on the podcast is sometimes those constraints in the proposal can seem really frustrating at the time. Like, oh, I only have a 500-word limit and you want me to answer all these questions. But actually, that sometimes does us a favor because it forces us to think about what's really important here and how can we write tight to clearly convey with impact what we want to say, what the need is, what type of difference we're going to make with this program. So while those constraints may be difficult to navigate and jump through all those hoops, it actually can be super helpful to help us figure out, is this a good fit? Like Colton said, is this really what we want to implement? If we're funded, do we have the capacity for this? And can we implement this well? Or is it going to spread our team too thin? So it really helps the nonprofit think through those elements to make sure that it is the right fit and we really can distill down to the core of what we're asking for. Without those constraints, we'd be all over the place and, hey, can you just throw in money for a new printer and why not add a van while we're at it and a few other things, and then you're getting really messy and off track. So by having those clear definitions in the guidelines, here's the type of project we're looking for, here's what we're wanting to fund, you can stay within those constraints and actually end up doing a better job if you really are diligent about staying within those and doing it well.
Yeah, Teresa, I love that you identified that structure is so important just from the beginning to make sure it's successful.
It's uncomfortable, but it's good.
Yeah. It gets you going on the right path. Alice, what else would you like to add here? Why are grant proposals important to nonprofit organizations, and why is preparation so key for successful proposals?
Yeah, so absolutely. One of the things that I have taught in grant writing for the last 15 to 20 years is that that 80-20 rule that says that 80% of your time in writing a grant proposal should be spent in that development stage and putting all the pieces together. And if you have spent that 80% of time, it will only take you 20% of the time to pick up a funder's application instructions and tie what you've already written to their formats and things like that. So you can plan a project once and lay out all your need and what you're going to see changed and what your approach is going to be and how you're going to evaluate it and what your budget is. You plan it once, then you can pull out the pieces and target it to each funder. And that's what we teach at GrantStation. That's what I've taught in all my trainings over the years, because that's where grant writing, I think, does get like really frustrating and confusing, is when you just pick up those applications instructions and try to answer the questions. And like Colton was talking about from the reviewer side, you can tell on that reviewer side when they haven't done any planning, because the beginning of the application doesn't connect to the end and the budget doesn't match the approach and all those kinds of things. So planning is absolutely the key to developing competitive proposals.
Awesome. Thanks, Alice. I love that. That provides a great segue into our next question, which I'm also going to kind of pick up something from Teresa's answer as well. Teresa, you were talking about how to write tight. So I'll start this one off with you. But how can nonprofit professionals clearly communicate their organization's goals when writing that proposal?
Writing tight's one of my favorite things, although a lot of people hate it, but it's actually made me a much better writer over the years, is really having to rework and think. And so a couple of things along those is to make sure you're writing in action words, clear, actionable things, not just if we were awarded this, we could. That's very wishy-washy and past tense, talking about a future event. So that's kind of a red flag in your writing. But if you think about clear action words, with these funds, we will implement, we will do this. So thinking very visionary, painting the picture, and with goals and objectives specifically, we want to throw in everything but the kitchen sink, and that's tempting. Like, oh, and let's add this and let's add that grade level and let's add spelling and math and this. But think about one thing to do for each objective, one thing that you want to measure and one thing that you want to accomplish. And if you end up with 2 or 3 things creeping in there, separate that out and make it very clear so that you can measure each objective specifically within those containers. And that's tough because but our program does so much. But again, going back to what we were saying with the planning and clarity, and like Alice was referring to, make sure you know what you're speaking to ahead of time and which piece specifically for this grant. You may not be talking about your whole organization. So think about which part you're addressing with this grant and then breaking it down even more with this goal and with these objectives, and break that down step by step and keep it clear and simple. We tend to overcomplicate, at least I do, and we want to throw it all in and explain it all, but we need to just break it down, break it simple, because like Colton said, they're reading 50 or 100 of these a week. So the more clear you can make it for them, the easier it makes them to say yes and make a good decision in your favor.
Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful to think about. Get it down to like the simplest, most granular that you can when you're writing. Thanks, Teresa. All right, Colton, turning to you. What are some ways nonprofits can effectively communicate their goal when writing these proposals?
I think the first thing is you need to articulate the goals of your organization. I was on a call the other day with a nonprofit executive that's like, we do this and this and this and this. And about 5 minutes in, I'm like, now what do you do? So they did they wanted to do 300 things and, world peace. And I'm like, okay, yes, but. So I always encourage folks to do, whether it's one program or one service or do one thing at a time. Develop that. Apple didn't come out with the Mac, the iPad, the iPhone, and the iPod all at the same time. They evaluated, they learned, they grew, they developed. And so, really with communicating their goals is by clearly stating, this is what we do, this is why we do it, this is how we do it, versus like, following every new funding lead to be like, well, I could do an after school program, or, oh, we could have a food pantry. And I'm like, okay, you could, but you can't be all things to all people. And I've worked with organizations that have tried to do that. And generally by the time I'm called, they're like, yeah, we do too much. I'm like, you think? So I try to help them focus in on a couple things. The other thing is, from a funder's perspective, if you don't tell me how you're going to measure something, I'm going to tell you how to measure it. So from Teresa's standpoint, she was sharing about one thing you want to measure. If you don't come to me with a complete thought, I'm going to help you complete it. And you don't want me to do that. So always having it be very clear on how you define success. And if a foundation wants you to track a different method of success, great, they can pay for that. So you have to be clear on what you're committed to measuring, and what constitutes success for you, versus someone else trying to fill in the colors outside the line if you don't put up clear lines. So that's just another thing from a funder's perspective. And I've seen it, and I've had to measure those things before, because no one's like, oh, here's what success is. And they're like, oh, here's what we think it is. I'm like, dang. So don't do that. Be nice to your evaluator.
Yeah, I think that structure that Teresa was mentioning earlier goes both ways. You need to put that in place for yourself, like you were talking about, Colton. All right, Alice, I'd love to hear from you some more ways that nonprofit organizations, some strategies they can use to be really clear in communicating their goals in grant proposals.
Yep. And so I really want to, echo what those guys were saying. And I also want to add a layer onto that of being able to communicate the differences that your programs make, communicating the outcomes that the people that you serve are achieving. And, more and more funders and donors are looking for that kind of so what question of, so what that you've offered this service, did anybody get better? Did, people who were homeless get homes? Did people who were, in poor mental health have better mental health? All those kinds of things. And so it doesn't have to be super challenging, but it is something that nonprofits really do have to sit down. And if you're not doing it, you have to set up a system in place to measure those outcomes, measure those changes in your community or in your target population. And that's, what you're really selling to a funder is this difference that you make, your solutions to challenges in the community. So setting up an outcome measurement system, if you'd like, as a term, I think is really critical to really help in your own sustainability as an organization, as opposed to just measuring what you do and adding that layer of how people change.
Yeah, that's a really key kind of language perspective to add there. It's all about kind of what are the outcomes? What are you measuring? Yeah, but what is that? What does it mean? If data is not telling a story, it's not making a difference. So yeah, I love that, Alice. All right, Meredith, what other strategies can nonprofit professionals use to clearly communicate their organization's goals in the proposal?
Love everything that's been shared. I'll add this one tangible piece. Often I am reading a narrative and I get to the end of page 1, end of page 2, and I think, wait, what do you do? And you don't ever want to have a funder be in that situation. And so one of the ways you can make sure that you are crystal clear, they know right from the get-go who you are, who you serve, and why it's important, is through a tangible transformation sentence. So this is something I teach within the collective. I'm dropping it in the chat box so you can see the structure. So here's how it goes. We help a specific identity, who you serve, achieve a tangible transformation, that one thing that Colton wants you focusing on, so that you can avoid the number one pain or achieve a number one desire. The biggest mistake I see when people put tangible transformation sentences together is in the tangible transformation portion, they list everything you do. A list of services is not the tangible transformation. The transformation is the piece that Alice was talking about, like going from being homeless to having a home. That is tangible. I'm going to drop in 3 examples because I know that that's a helpful way to learn. So dropping those in right now. Okay, so let's see if this is going to work. Okay, there's 3 different examples there. They're kind of blended together, but just so you can read this. We help residents of Alaska's Copper River Basin identity, provide nutritious and healthy foods for their families, tangible transformation, so that they're avoiding the number 1 pain, which is going hungry, right? Or Safe House Arts helps new and emerging artists identity, get affordable rehearsal and performance space, tangible transformation, so they can develop their craft without financial hardship, avoiding a number 1 pain. So I hope that simple sentence structure leads everything you do, so that there's no guessing about what you do and how, and like the value you deliver and who you're serving it to. So it's a simple thing. You should use it everywhere you go. And honestly, I just love the power of a TTS. And I think you'll find that your funders do too.
Yes, that is so powerful, and having those examples just like demonstrates that. So thank you, Meredith. Appreciate you dropping the template and the examples in the chat. Excited to see what everyone does with those and the power that comes from that. So we have one more question for our panelists, but we've reached our halfway point. So I want to jump into a few audience questions that have been submitted as well. So I'm going to jump into a few of those now, but keep sending in your questions if you're listening, because we want to hear from you and get those questions answered. So I'm going to actually, Meredith, start this question for you. So explain, and this was a question asked from the audience, explain how your enterprise will benefit marginalized grassroots people. We mostly do recruiting, so creating teaching jobs for youths who wouldn't have had access to jobs. Is that the answer? I believe that was the question.
Prosper, are you working on a grant application right now? It sounds like that's the question in your narrative. So that's exciting. Congrats on working on a narrative actively. So explain how your enterprise will benefit marginalized grassroots people. So clearly that is who the funder cares about and who they want to serve. And so we need to show a strong correlation between who you serve and who the funder wants to serve. So one thing you could do would be having a look at their funder history as well, getting an idea of how they have expressed their support for marginalized grassroots people, as they're saying. The one thing I would like to emphasize as you put together your response is I don't really love the word marginalized entirely. There's a lot, I was certainly trained as a grant writer to write about all the things that were wrong with the community. And there's a really positive shift right now to writing about what's strong versus what's wrong. That's how I like to think about it. So when you do talk about how you're helping the youth that you're serving, I want you to also really play up like the great things that they have going for them and how you're helping propel them forward even faster by providing the service that you do with finding great teaching jobs. So you just might spend some time thinking about how can I communicate the benefits, focusing on what's strong, not just what's wrong. I hope that is helpful.
I love that, Meredith. I think that's so helpful to have that focus on what's strong, not what's wrong, like that perspective going in. All right, this next question is kind of a two-parter and directed to Colton and Alice. So I'll kind of read through it. So how do you avoid telling the stories that Colton mentioned while also communicating the outcome of the programs, which Alice referenced? Seems like the outcomes are told from the stories. So Colton, I'm going to start with you, and then also after you're finished answering the question, Alice, if you would also jump in. So yeah, how do you get the message across without telling a story?
Yeah, so I think any good program has a good logic model. So I'm more of a program evaluator versus a grant writer. So I work really hard on designing a program that's going to have an outcome. So an output is the things you can count. I call it the butts and seats number. Who attended, who showed up, how many people completed, while an outcome is a change in knowledge, attitude, behavior, or skill, or situation. So you could say, oh, well, an output is we served 50 individuals experiencing homelessness. That's an output. An outcome would be we got 50 people into affordable housing and they stayed in affordable housing for the 6 months of the program. That is more of an outcome. That's a change in situation. So I think oftentimes when I say stories, I think of like the story you put in like an annual report or maybe in an annual appeal, where it's like, little Johnny was in our after school program and he thought it was really great. His grades are up and he's doing amazing. I'm like, okay, good for him, but what about everyone else? So if you're evaluating and tracking those outcomes, within a government grant, I never mention any names. I don't tell any stories. I just say, this program out of the, 80 participants, so percentage of someone's going to do something better. I'm going to quantify it. The qualitative or the stories that we tell with impact, that's kind of that's an example of one person. So what you want to do from an evaluation standpoint, and when you're writing a grant, about 10% or 5 to 10% should be allocated towards evaluation. We can fight over that number a little bit if we want to. But being able to track your impact is going to help you get more money. So creating a good, strong logic model and knowing the difference between your outputs and your outcomes is really important. And you can track an outcome from a 30-minute program. Like, you can have an outcome out of that. So just being mindful of, sure, the ultimate outcome for your organization might be world peace. I always use this as the example, because how are you going to measure that? But if, they learned something about world peace in your program, all right, you're getting a little closer. Take responsibility for your little piece of the impact pie and try not to eat the whole thing.
Awesome. Alice, would you also address that as well?
I love that analogy, Colton, the impact pie. So yeah, and I have just a little different flavor from that, but I really agree with what Colton was saying about, having those logic models that tells, the story of, kind of what you do and how much you do, and then what changes because of what you do. But I do like to weave in stories to kind of engage both the mind and the hearts of the reader. That it's mostly the data is what I'm pushing, but I'm going to weave in a little more creatively to keep the interest. Just because I think sometimes I've been on the end of being a great reviewer and it's just like facts and boring, and I just, it just like my interest isn't even there. So that's where I like to have a little bit of that kind of letting them not only know the numbers and be informed, but also have that kind of tug on, ooh, I did see little Johnny in that, in that story or whatever. And that really engaged me. So I think it's kind of a blend, that it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other, that you can do both. Your space and how much space you have is, gonna, impact that a lot. But I do like to kind of do both.
Yeah, thank you, Colton and Alice. I think that was really helpful for taking those into your mindset as you're writing those grant proposals. Teresa, I'm going to direct this next question to you. So this is from Kyla. Can there be a discussion about boundaries in this profession in terms of what responsibilities are or are not reasonable for the grant writer to take on?
Ooh, I love this question. And when I was a new consultant, I didn't know. I just thought I was supposed to do anything and everything. And I didn't understand the nuances and which things are appropriate or not upfront. So I'm really glad you brought this question up. I have seen consultants do this different ways. I have seen some who literally only help with the narrative. They don't do budgets, paperwork, submission, reporting, anything. And then I've seen others who really like to help with the whole process, from putting together the grant, advising on the budget, helping with the reporting, making sure those deadlines and reports are turned in on time throughout the grant award process. The key is to make sure it's really clear upfront which parts you are helping with and which parts you are not. And then to not be afraid to push back when your client says, oh, hey, we have a grant report due and you're supposed to be doing this. Refer back to those boundaries that you set up front. Make sure it's in your contract very clear which responsibilities are yours and which ones are the clients or the nonprofits. And that will help a lot up front of making sure it's super clear in which pieces of it you enjoy helping with. Are you helping with grant searches as well and building those partnerships? Or is that something entirely on them and you only help with the writing? So with a lot of those pieces, there's not necessarily a right or wrong. I do encourage the nonprofit to build relationships with funders themselves as opposed to being dependent upon me. I like to have them be the face of the organization. While I may communicate with the funder on questions, deadlines, finding out more, I really think it's important for them to build that partnership with the funder over time and have them be the face and the representative. So there's not a black and white answer, but I think the big key, like I said, is to really clarify upfront, and that will help alleviate a lot of those headaches and the angst later on of trying to navigate some of those issues. And I'd love to hear what some of the others have experienced around that too.
Yeah, Meredith, would you jump in here on this answer as well? Teresa, I love that. I think that starting with expectations for boundaries in any situation, whether you're stepping in to help with grant writing or just kind of in any like professional project or things like that.
Good relationship skills.
In relationships, yeah, I think advice for grant writing and life. But Meredith, yeah. I'd love to hear you kind of jump in on this one too.
Yeah, I don't think I have a coaching call where we don't have a conversation about this because boundaries are hard, to your point. One of the ways you can get an idea of what support they're going to need is making sure your eyes are wide open when the project's getting started. So I use a tool called the Project Planning Toolkit, and it essentially brings us back to the first question that we asked, which is your grant readiness. An organization's grant readiness will really influence that role that you would play. Now, whether you strictly stay in the lane of grant writing or not depends on a couple of things. One, your background skills. Sometimes maybe you have a super specialty in childhood therapy and you could really help design the program because of that expertise, right? So it's not that or maybe you love the grant reporting part for like, you're not wired the way I am, but maybe that's the part that you love and you want to play a role in that portion of the scope of work. So what's fun about this line of work is that there is no right or wrong way to do it. And you should definitely know yourself well enough to know, what am I really good at? What do I get fire from? And what is it that I actually hate doing? And make sure that I don't touch that piece. And I either partner with someone who can, or make sure that they can handle it in-house. So part of it is making sure you're taking the time to do the inner reflection to know, what do you want to be doing? How do you want this relationship to look? And making sure you're taking on a client that passes what I call the 5-year test, which is, do I see myself working with this organization for 5 years? And if that answer is not heck yes, then it's a no, because it means you actually have some reservations you're not being honest with yourself about. So that would be some things to think about as you ponder the very complex question of boundaries.
Yes, lots to ponder when it comes to boundaries, indeed, Meredith. And I think that 5-year test, super helpful, like just tactical thing to keep in your back pocket when you're pondering. All right, this is a question from Hannah Rose that I'm going to direct to you, Alice. So what are your views or opinions on organizations that have distributed leadership models versus a more hierarchical structure in terms of funders interested in supporting those organizations?
Great. That's a tough one, Hannah. I like it though. I think, from my experience, I think that, one of the things that you do have to do is have, a set group of people who are communicating with the funder. That, you could have a flatter organization, but you really kind of want, 1 or 2 or 3 key people working with the funder. And I think that they would appreciate that over a broader, flatter organization, just because it's harder for them to manage, all 5 of us versus just me telling them. And then, but I also think that there's a trend right now with just the pandemic and, funders having lived through that as we did as nonprofits, and how they're looking at different structures and looking at, increasing the kind of the diversity, inclusion, equality kind of thing, and looking at different things and looking at things through a different lens. And I really hope that that's something that continues, that they will see that it's not just one model or just the way, it's traditionally been done, those kinds of things, and looking to advance, newer and different looking models. And so I'm hoping that that is the trend, because it seems like it is, and hopefully it'll continue as we kind of continue to get out of this. So I think that's an evolving question, and would like to hear what you guys have to say about that.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that question, Alice. To make sure that we're getting to a lot of the questions answered, I'm gonna turn to Colton now for a question from Sarah in the chat, who asked, Colton, can you speak more to government grants from the perspective of municipality applying? What are governments, state or federal, looking for?
Yeah, so very broadly, when we say county grants or city or state, it's kind of the same thing because a lot of that money trickles down. So when you're applying for a CDGB grant, a community development block grant from, say, your local city, it actually had multiple pit stops on the journey to reach the city. So, they still have to report back to HUD. And so it's all kind of the same at the end of the day. I would say government grants take about 100 to 125 hours to write, a good one. If you prep in advance, you can do that a lot faster. But what essentially they're looking for is, seeing that you have the data to show what you're proposing to do is going to, happen. To my knowledge, there's no government fund out there that just just apply and tell us what you're going to do. Most of the time, I call it government contracting, because you're essentially doing a service for the government, whether it's helping individuals experience homelessness get into a home, whether it's providing some type of education program for young people. They've essentially said, we need this and we need someone to do it, not the government. So you're applying for something very specific. Oftentimes they'll tell you in some cases what to measure. I have a whole hour webinar on just intro to government grants, so I'm not going to get too much into this, but essentially they're looking at that. And then also they're making sure your organization is set up in a way where you're not going to fail. So they're not going to take a bet on a government contractor that doesn't have everything together, and you won't get funded. So, making sure you have a good governance structure, you need to have policies and procedures. Like Alice said earlier, the government wants to see all those policies and procedures. There's so many attachments. And so, updating those, they want to know your organizational structure. So talking about the org chart, hierarchical, things like that. And they're also going to look very closely at your finances. The number one thing when folks tell me I want to get a government grant, I'm like, let me see your financial statements. They're like, why are you starting with that? I'm like, I want to make sure you can actually manage a federal grant. So if it takes 60 to some cases 90 days to get paid for a service you've provided today, I need to make sure you're going to have money in 2 months to make payroll. So you have to have really good cash flow in some instances to get a government grant. The last nugget I will put on that is, if you want to receive government grants, your organization needs to get a line of credit and not use it. So people give you a line of credit when your credit is good. So when your organization has money, people are more likely to say, sure, we'll extend a credit line to you, versus, oh crap, we've run out of money and need to make payroll. No bank's going to give you money then. So, just having some of the financial aspects in place and, answering the question, are we ready for a government grant, is a little sometimes more complicated than are we ready for, a $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 grant. So that it's all about scale, and government grants are made to scale.
Awesome. Thanks, Colton. Yeah, gotta make sure you've got your house in order. There was a question in the chat about kind of grant competitiveness, especially during the pandemic, with which Meredith answered. So make sure everybody go and read that. I'm going to turn now to a question from Jessica and pose this to Teresa. I can definitely see the way focusing on one thing or another, or one thing can help volunteer organizations with a specific purpose. But could you please give an example of this to something like a library, which, depending on the surrounding community, kind of is expected to be a little bit of everything? Teresa, you were talking about kind of like making it simple. So would love to hear you speak to this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where this would be a good opportunity to look at which areas are the biggest need in your community right now. Does your community need support with after school care and partnering with the schools to offer some kind of program in that regard? Do you need help in the younger preschool ages with parents as teachers and some of those early childhood programs? Do you need help with adult literacy or job support and training? So really looking at your program needs, and strategic planning can come into play here, of doing a community assessment first, looking at that bigger picture and seeing what are the gaps that we can help fill. And even though, yes, a library encompasses so many services and parts of the community, what are the biggest gaps right now that you can serve that other organizations are not already doing? And where can you help fill those gaps? So I would start by looking at that and looking at it strategically, as opposed to just let's grow everything all at once. Figure out who's not filling these gaps, what's missing in our community, and how are we best positioned to fill that. And if you don't have the resources, like we were saying before with mission creep, don't try to bend out of shape, but what's the most alignment with what you can offer to meet what the community needs right now for the next 6 months, year, 2 years, looking at that as a bigger picture and how you fit into that puzzle.
Awesome. Thanks, Teresa. I think that's really helpful framework to use moving forward. Meredith, I'm going to pose this next one to you. So this is from Christopher in the chat, or in the questions tab. Or excuse me, this is from Stanley. Is the fundraising strategy of only going for grant opportunities in organizations where the nonprofit already has established a connection or an influential contact person the best way to have a high conversion rate in grant writing?
Great question, Stanley. So when I think about a funding strategy, it does not have to require that you already have a relationship, because it can be now setting the tone for where do we want to go build relationships? Where do we want to invest our time? I'm a huge fan of doing a funding strategy. Like, don't even bother writing grants until you've done one of these, because we need to know what are the handful of grants that we actually should pursue, that we have the highest chance of winning and the best return on investment, which is your precious time. And so it's a wonderful activity to go through, even if you have no idea about any of the funders that pop up on your list. But if they are passing this, very specific test that I like to send those funders through to get them to the bottom of the funnel, and they make it to the bottom of the funnel, then now we have a very strong case to go and build that relationship over time so that they can become a great funder. Obviously, you want to leverage the relationships you already have. One of the ways you can do that is ask them, hey, we would like to get an introduction to the Imaginary Foundation. Do you know anyone over there? And if someone that already funds you provides that introduction, you are getting a nice, warm, trusty intro, like open the doors. It's a way better way to approach it than, to try to necessarily do that in cold outreach. So leverage the relationships you have, but let's go much more broad in your funding strategy as you're looking forward to the next 18 months of how you're going to get your organization funded.
Awesome. Thanks, Meredith. So with that, we're going to kind of wrap up this portion of the panel. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question. Love to see those coming in. If you did not get your question answered, we want to answer those questions for you. So a couple of things. We'll send a survey in the chat where you can submit your question afterward, and we'll get back to you with the answer. Or I know Alice and Meredith and Teresa and Colton are all active on LinkedIn. So I'm going to say you can reach out to them on LinkedIn and ask your questions as well. Well, kind of as we're wrapping up here, I just want to say also thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists. This has been such a rich session in content and grant writing empowerment, and I love seeing all the chat going back and forth and all the encouragement happening in there. So I'll kind of pose this last question to everyone. Today we centered our conversation around strengthening your grant proposals. What conversations are you hoping that these organizations will continue to have in the coming weeks? And Alice, I'll kick it off with you.
Great. Well, I do think that, now really is a good time to be a grant writer. With the additional funding streams coming, still trickling down through the rescue plan, with foundations having done very well. I think I just would encourage you that it's a great time to be looking for funds. And so just kind of continuing to develop and get those projects planned and lined up is a really great strategy, to push forward. And I think that also, when we were talking about trends, that again, funders are also seeing that, that necessity to fund more like operating costs and capacity building costs. So helping you develop your own structures is a little bit more at the top of the list than it was just even 4 years ago. So hopefully, reaching out and just realizing that it is a good time to be a grant writer. So just keep at it.
Awesome. Thanks, Alice. Teresa?
Something that I have really been talking about a lot on the podcast and that we've talked a lot about here today is the importance of a strategic approach. Whether it's with grants, with your overall nonprofit, really step back and think about the bigger picture. A lot of nonprofits flounder, and it's because they're just firing off applications, hoping something sticks. And maybe if we send out enough, sooner or later we'll get one back. That's not a good strategy. You can do much better. Step back, think through your grant readiness, think through a solid foundation, make sure you have these key pieces in place that we've talked about today, and look at it much more deliberately and finding the right fit as opposed to just trying to find anybody that'll fund you. Think those through and talk as a team about that and how you can work together as a team for that strategic approach to it, and you'll see a lot more success long term.
Yes. Colton, would you answer now?
Sure. So, I agree with what both Alice and Teresa said, and I'm sure we could speak for like 6 more hours on grants and like little tips and tricks. But I would encourage everyone to really look at how they're evaluating their programs. I teach funders how to deny proposals, essentially. And, I never tell them this is how we approve good ideas. This is how we go through and figure out what's a good idea, what's a good proposal, what's a bad idea, what's a good proposal. And so trying to figure out the different types of proposals and how to push them forward. I worked at a foundation that had an annual budget of $1 million for a particular program. It was a quarterly cycle. We got $2.5 million in requests in the first quarter. So sometimes when you get that letter, it says we had many good ideas, but not enough money. That's kind of true. So what you want to do is figure out what data do you have and what evidence do you have really to showcase that your program is going to have an impact. So, making sure you're writing a good proposal, but also if you're not in charge of actually implementing the grant, making sure that those folks are actually tracking that data because that's going to get them the next grant. So hitting home that, a grant doesn't end when you get the check. It really ends when everything's turned in, you've done the program, you've done the evaluation. So making sure you start strong and you finish strong and you're just hustling the whole way through is what's going to be important for you to get additional funding.
Yes. Thank you, Colton. Meredith, would you wrap us up?
Certainly. The grant making industry has gone through a lot of change, good change since COVID hit, to the point of talking about going from what's wrong to what's strong in our writing. And also a more common question you're seeing in your grant proposals, which is great, which is, how is your organization committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what I'm seeing often is that the answer is pretty fluffy and generic. Well, we hire equitably, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's bogus. We got to take it to another level. One resource that you could consider bringing back to your organization and hosting a book club with is Trudy LeBron's new book. It's called The Anti-Racist Business Book. And I know it says business, but you could definitely apply it to the work you do in your nonprofits. I'm dropping a link in the chat. We're doing this internally, and it has had a really big change on policies that we have, like a scholarship program and all of these different things, failed payments and how you handle things to actually integrate what you say you are and do to what you actually do. So I would encourage everyone to be a leader in your own organization to spearhead this kind of change so that when you as a grant writer are tasked with answering that response, you can in a meaningful and authentic way, not a fluffy way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meredith. And thank you to everyone who was a panelist today, Alice, Teresa, Colton, and Meredith. Really appreciate all of your insights and engagement and just so many good things for everyone to take away and implement. Also, thank you to everyone who attended today's panel. I appreciate you being here and bringing your questions and your energy in the chat. I hope you guys had a great time and learned something that's going to benefit the work that you do on a daily basis. We've got more panels coming up the rest of the summer and into the fall, including 2 tomorrow at 12 and noon. So tune in for those. You can find them on the NX Unite page or on the NX Unite LinkedIn page. Registration is now open. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be sending some information to you after this panel, including a survey. Fill it out, and we'd love to hear your feedback. It's been a pleasure speaking with all of you. I hope you have a wonderful day and good luck with grant writing.